Hello and welcome once again to Clash Course. My name is Joey Livingston, and my punching bag, as always, is Greg Brahe. How are you doing today, Greg?
I am wonderful. How are you, Joey?
I'm doing fine, thank you. And thank you for accepting my label. You're usually much more feisty than that, but I like you this way better.
I don't mind being your assistant host. That's okay.
Well, actually, I called you that off the air, so I should have just pretended like he said that about himself. Oh, okay. No, I called you a punching bag.
I
Yeah.
just didn't hear that one. I don't actually pay attention to you most of when you talk. So,
You know, this show is supposed to be about two people arguing and being kind to one another, and you're not setting a good example.
I actually would argue that not listening to you is being kinder to you than listening to everything you have to say.
You are so vicious. Okay, so I think there's a few things that you and I want to discuss before we get right into it. Before the show, you were talking about a movie. It's called Kamari. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a somebody in the Cult of Honesty on Facebook recommended a movie that was called Kumare. It's available on Netflix, but it's about a guy from New Jersey. I don't remember his name, like Sean or something, who wanted to know. He, sort of was driven by the same questions that drive most, if not all of us, I think, and that brings a lot of people to the New Covenant group as well. The deeper questions of the meaning of life and things along that nature. And he started going around and talking to different gurus about this or learning more about what they had to say. And he decided that they were all full of crap. That they were all just making it up as they went along. So he decided that he was going to test that by thrusting himself into that role and trying to become a guru, and became this character. And it's a documentary that follows him for
So
a year
he made up a
doing
religion.
this. Essentially, yes. I mean, in a way, it was interesting actually what he did with his personal approach
Yeah.
to it. Was he is the mirror who shows you yourself.
Ah. So
So
what I heard, I haven't seen the movie, but what I heard is that he made up a religion, and he got a lot of people involved in it, and just buying the whole thing from A to Z. And then at the end, he just revealed that he had just made it all up.
yeah, and it was interesting because I don't want to give too much away for the ending, but the
Well,
ending,
listen. Let's just do this. Spoiler alerts. You
right?
can not watch this part, but I mean I heard about this ending on This American Life, I believe.
Really?
So
Well,
go ahead.
let's say that the goal is for him to reveal it at the end, and that's his intention
Okay,
to
I'm going to say what
reveal
I
it
heard
and
on this.
and do this to reveal that gurus are full of crap is his
I'm going
goal
to go
at the
ahead and
beginning.
say what I heard, okay? Because I have
All
not
right.
seen the movie, so I'm only coming from the perspective of somebody who listened to This American Life. I'm pretty sure that that's where I heard it from. But it was just people discussing publicly on a show this movie that he revealed it at the end, and a lot of people who were involved in the religion basically didn't care. They just, I think they even continued in the religion.
Yeah, that is true. Yeah, and I mean, some people did leave, but I would actually argue that a fair degree of that is because of what the religion he created was, and that it was all about him being the mirror to show you yourself, and it was actually just you are the guru. Find the guru inside of you,
Uh,
and then at the end he said, like my name's Sean or whatever the name actually is, and said like that Kumare is the guru in me. That's and sort of his
I see.
approach to it.
I see.
But anyway, we got to talking about that and how I actually thought it was a good thing just from the skepticism side initially, the revealing these things. I love people who publicly debunk bad belief. It's a wonderful thing to impersonate or recreate. I mean, James Randi is fantastic at that. But then the message that it sent was also a very good one. I recommend people watching it. But when we got to talking about it, I realized that we've already started a cult, and Joey, I think that you have the most guru-like look. So I'm here publicly challenging you to become a guru. Find the guru in you, Joey.
Now, when you say I have the look, What specifically do you mean?
Well, you have the beard, you have the longer hair. You're thin. These are things that are
I'm thin?
generally
Wow.
well. I mean, compared to me, and
Yeah.
well, I'm not going to comment on anybody else's.
You haven't seen my tum tum. I'm trying to get rid of it.
You have a thin face. That's the important part. Wear big robes.
When I was a teenager, like when I was 17, 18 years old, I was super skinny. Like somebody needed to sponsor me. That I was that skinny. And during that period of my life, I just a confession here. I did a lot of drugs. And I actually I'm not going to get into how this happened, but I legitimately came across the money that belonged to me, that was just basically just given to me. It was out of a insurance settlement for an accident that I was in. I got $8,000, and I took that check because I had no bank account, and I went to a check cashing place, and I got a big fat roll of 20s and $100 bills. I think it was all just 20s because it was a huge roll of money. And I used that money to bankroll myself and some other potheads across the country from Oklahoma City, which is where I was raised, to Oregon and back. We were actually the plan was actually to go there and get a job, and we were all going to get jobs and settle in Oregon. But what we didn't take into account is that we were potheads, and potheads don't get jobs. So we went.
They do in Oregon now.
Yeah.
Though,
The effect was that we went there, realized that we didn't have enough money to stick around very long, and we just headed home. It was different back then. I mean, it was very much a hit. We went to Eugene, Oregon, which is very much a hippie town. But I mean, I wasn't enough of a pothead to think living as a homeless person was a good idea. So we rolled back home. But the reason why I bring this up is because I was super skinny back then. And I went by my middle name. My legal name is Timothy Josiah Livingston. I've been called Joey since the day I was born. But I went by my middle name, Josiah. And people call me Josiah just because I thought it sounded funky. And I shaved my head just because I wanted to shave my head. I had no intentions here in mind. I just chose to go by a different name. And I shaved my head, and I wore these hippie shirts because I thought they were stylish. And there were several potheads who hung on my every word because my name was Josiah, and I was bald and skinny. And they listened to everything that I had to say.
There you go. You're already there.
Yeah.
You just got to find those potheads again. Go back to Oregon because they're
start with the potheads.
Or is that Washington? I keep forgetting which of the two states was it over there that now that's legal.
Colorado,
and
Washington,
or Oregon.
Yeah, I believe Washington and Colorado.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure about Oregon. You would think that Oregon would have been the first.
Yeah.
But yeah, interesting times. The thing that I wanted to bring up is that I hate you for showing me that Boxcar 2D site. You posted on Facebook a evolution simulator called Boxcar 2D that basically started with just wheels and things that connected wheels together, and randomly generated something that might be a car. It might not even be a car. It might not even have any wheels. And then it would see how far it went, and if it went, and if it didn't go any further, it just started the race over again with a brand new car, and it did this 20 times, and then after that 20 times, it would take the car that went the furthest and breed it with a random car from the next generation of 20 cars. Am I getting this correct so far?
It's close. Actually, what it does is it randomly breeds within the ones that were there. So
No. I'm pretty sure about this. It starts with the fastest car. If you watch it, I should know. I stared at it for hours. Well, I ran it in the background because I have to get some work done. But I ran it in the background, and I would randomly check it, and it would. This evolution simulator was constantly getting better. It wasn't on a constant, consistent uphill run, but there was a trend to creating a better car over time. And every time it started the new generation, the fastest car from the last generation was at the top.
Oh, that's actually one of the options on it is called Elite Selection. You'll see that across the bottom. It's a little thing you can click. That it just actually copies the car that performed the best. And I think it might actually be the top 2 cars directly into the next one.
It was on by default.
Breeding.
Well, I think
the
the top 2 cars depends on whether you select the tournament mode or the roulette mode. And I think roulette mode starts with the top 2 cars, and tournament starts with the top 1. Anyways, this was fascinating to me, and I couldn't stop running it. I had to actually compromise on myself. I had to say, okay, self, you can't stare at this all day, and I know that you want to see these things evolve, so just run it in the background. Just run it in a tab, and then you can check on it from time to time, and that was the only way that I could get away from it.
Isn't it weird how you can sit and just watch it? Casey loves to do that with me. He's like, hey, let's watch the motorcycle game, he calls it, or the car game.
It's one of the best games I've played in a long time, and I don't push any buttons or anything.
Yeah, all you do is sit and watch it, and it's like, man, it's a stoner's dream, actually.
They had all kinds of racetracks, and depending on the racetrack and the amount of wheels that you allowed, a very unique car would evolve every time, something different, and it depended on the track that you picked. If you picked a track that had a lot of hills and bumps and stuff, usually a slender type of car that could deal with those bounces would evolve. If you picked the gap track, which had a lot of gaps, a car that had larger wheels that could deal with those corners would inevitably evolve. But they would always look different.
I like Blockhead is mine. It plows through consecutively larger stacks of blocks, and then I like that one.
All right, we're boring our audience. You need to watch that though. Boxcar2d.com. If you like having your day sucked away and wasted, you'll love this site.
Well, before we move on from that, I have to say that the reason, of course, that I posted that was in response to a challenge from Alan Darley, who had said that random chance with selection cannot produce improvement. With non-artificial, but selection based on the environment. This is the absolute debunking of that statement. Is what this does. It is by definition random chance. You've got randomly assigned wheel sizes, random amounts of torque, random lengths. It all starts with sort of a point, and then different
Well, I want to say a couple things about that. Number one, I guess that I always viewed it in elite selection. I never viewed it without elite selection. What you're saying, if it's not an elite selection, it breeds a random car from the prior generation with a random car from the next generation?
No, elite selection doesn't actually change the breeding process. What that does is it literally just copies the top 2 cars from the previous one and puts them into the new generation. It adds an element of artificial selection to it, so it speeds up the process, sort of like.
But without elite selection, it still breeds the fastest car from the prior generation with a random car from the next.
It does. There's 2 modes. There's tournament or roulette. What it does is it makes them compete for the ability to breed, so that you have your best cars end up competing with the best, and so on and so forth. And the roulette wheel sort of makes it. They put like a roulette wheel, and they determine sort of weighted averages of how well it did, and then sort of spin a random spinner. And if it falls on that car gets to breed, and then it removes that car and does it again. So then you can have the next generation is primarily produced by 2 or 3 cars, if they did really well.
So would you say that that's a metaphor for survival of the fittest?
Yes, and fittest, of course, being a non-teleological phrase, but related instead to the fittest for whatever environment they happen to be in. Another fun thing you can do with that, by the way, is it's got the input like seed car and change terrain option. That if you go in and you just click to go to a different terrain and then cancel, it actually takes whatever population you currently have, and this is like a glitch that they figured out that's cool, and it puts it into a new terrain, and that will change the shape so that your car that was doing the best no longer will be.
Well, so did you at any point try copying a car and actually inputting it into that interface?
Yeah, I've played with this quite a bit,
Yeah.
and it never works quite right either. Like
Really?
there's when
What?
you can like design cars and copy
Mm-hmm.
cars.
Yeah.
You can make your own car, and it's still even then. Designing cars, I've noted at least it might just be that my computer was glitching, but it's never quite a perfect copy because it's still even when you copy it in, it introduces the mutation rate.
I was maybe I just wasn't being critical with my eye, but I was always looked exactly like what I designed. Yeah, there's a design interface, and you copy it, and it would be this series of like 512 characters or something that would represent that represented your design. And
Genetic code.
That's what I said. I said that this is like a metaphor for the genetic code. And you could paste it into that clipboard and say input this car, and it would it would race that car, and then it would put it into the breeding pool.
Yep.
Okay. That
Yeah, it's got
conversation
it all
is over.
explained on the website. So,
All right.
hey, anybody who's more curious, boxcar2d.com.
Boxcar number 2
Really cool.
letter D.com. Yeah, fascinating. Okay, so I think we're out of time.
And that's the show. Thanks for joining us.
All right, so we got
Stick
a few minutes
around
here.
for-
Let's get back to last week. We were continuing. This is our longest running conversation so far, where we were talking about the is it Epicurus?
Epicurus, yep.
His
Determined we were saying it
the
wrong
statement
at first.
attributed to
I'll
him about basically questioning God and most likely even his existence, and there was one particular line which I guess is the third line. Is that correct?
It's the
It's the line that said, "If God is able but not willing, then He is malevolent."
it's the second clause. There's 4 clauses. It's the
Okay.
because there's the
Did I-
first
did-
is
did I quote that
willing and not
correctly?
able, then not willing. Yes.
Yeah.
Then willing and able, then unwilling and unable, or the 4.
But that line, "If He is able but not willing, then He is malevolent," is the line where you and I polarize.
Right. Well, to an extent, I think that we were able to agree that malevolent might be a little too harsh of a word, and it might be apathetic. Might be
Yes.
a better.
Well, I think a better way of putting that is that I eventually got you to come around a little bit more to my position. Correct?
Sure. Hey, I'm happy to admit that. Yep. You convinced me that it only disproves the idea of an all-loving God, not necessarily proves a hating God. a
Yeah,
malevolent
I'm not sure that I can argue an all-loving God unless I really do a rope-a-dope around you about what it means to be all-loving. Because I find a lot of scientists who are very loving people, and they do experiments which might stand a chance of being very harmful to the subjects involved, but they do it for a greater good. And I wouldn't, and by subjects I'm talking about bacteria, which
Sure,
is,
or mice, or
Yeah.
they're finally starting to move away from research on like chimps and the ones that we think may actually be smart enough to think about these things in the way people do to some extent, or children. So that's good.
yeah. The more I think about the universe and the galaxies that are in the universe and the concept of the multiverse, as a theist, I begin to toy around in my head of a big old scientist who's just running a bunch of tests and seeing all the different variations and in which universe, which galaxy produces the most fruitful results of life. That's where my imagination goes.
That's an interesting deist perspective, I guess. But I primarily, again, say that this argument is meant to be an argument against traditional theologies.
Sure.
And not traditional Christian theologies, mind you, because this again, was written by a person who existed in a very polytheistic culture. But traditional theologies about anthropomorphic, I guess, personal gods that have these emotional connections and that really actually care about what people do and
Right.
feel and say.
Right.
So the experimental God is certainly one that this argument does not really work well against.
I guess the end result of where I've been going this whole time is that as a loving father, I often let my children make their own choices, whether those choices may hurt themselves or hurt their brother or sister. Sometimes I just let them make those choices, and it is a scary thing. It is something that I'm very concerned about, but I'm also aware that if I don't allow my kids to think for themselves under as many circumstances as I can possibly bear, that they're not going to, that I'm going to actually stunt their growth in some way. That's the way I view it. And so when I scale that up to a quote unquote God who is a loving and our creator, our father in that sense, I kind of scale it to a point that is in my imagination beyond my comprehension, and then to say that this creator, for him to allow us on this earth to make decisions that could even destroy one another, when I scale it to that point, I have to concede in my mind the possibility that is a good thing.
I struggle with that as long as, I mean, again, it depends on how you're defining God. And of course, you and I have talked about your definition of God as simply the conscious and willful creator. Not that doesn't necessarily rule that out. I mean, it certainly, we can glean more about what kind of character that God would have. But,
right.
I look at these things generally from a argument against traditional theological
I do too, but I'm not a traditional theist, and you're arguing with me, and
I know,
and so I'm willing to.
The first time we did this show, though, you tried to argue for Calvinism. I thought that you were going to continue
you
being my
knew,
punching bag.
No. That
you
was
were going to
clearly,
let me use you to show how ridiculous traditional theology is.
Let me point out that the first argument that we had was about traditional Calvinism, and I mopped the floor with you in that argument, and so much so that I creeped you out.
That I'm not even going to argue against that. You're right. I mean, it's a pretty open and shut case of Calvinism. It's that,
I think that if we had a couple more rounds, you would have gone back to the drawing board and prepared yourself. But I came at you like some sadistic. Like perhaps John Calvin himself, and the only way to win that argument was to belittle you. But what you should have done was come at me from a human standpoint and make the plea of a human being, because that Calvinism is sick. But that was our first show.
That's the thing, though, is going against that one. It was me approaching your Calvinism in a way to try to. I guess the thought I was having was to try to disprove it using logic, but I was unwilling to, because of I guess for the sake of argument, I was granting your axioms from the get-go, and I was going to try to take it down. And it's like, well, the axioms in that certainly lead logically to the conclusions that if you are saved by grace alone, then some people actually are created just to be tools to teach other people, or to be essentially objects that are throwaway, then I have no way for me to say that I'm not just an object that can be thrown, or that's here to help the believers learn it.
Yeah.
But the difference is I'm okay with that.
Right.
That's
well,
I
was talking about that show after it was done. And it got me to thinking. I mean, the way that we argued, and I really feel that I did present something very compelling. These shows, like any fight, the victor is very much the perspective of whoever was your favorite. And we don't have any knockouts in this show, except, I mean, you might claim something different, but sad to say, I think I did a really great job in that show, but I was thinking afterwards, Greg really should have brought his emotion into it, and then my next thought was, we really should have a conversation about, does emotion play a part in logic? And I think that there is a place for emotion in logic, and I think sometimes emotion is the thing that breaks outside, that breaks us outside of a logical framework that may only be logical within its own circle. Because that logical framework was completely unfair to you.
But that's the thing, is logic in itself is devoid of emotion because of by its very nature. That's rhetoric is certainly not. I mean, I can make an argument that is not a logical argument. I
might grant that logic is certainly intended to be separate from emotion, but yet logic also observes emotion. Logic tries to look at the world from a non-emotional perspective, but emotion is part of the world that it's looking at.
Well, I think that you're in a way combining logic with the actions that are then based on that logic. And I will certainly grant that if we can come to a logical conclusion, but that doesn't mean that we must act upon that logical conclusion without then taking emotions into consideration. But emotions cannot themselves be included into logic for the very reason that it is outside of the scope of logic, and for good reason. If we start involving emotions,
but I think I'm speaking of it in a different sense. I'm not saying that. Most of your fallacies have to do with trying to pull emotion into logic, and I agree that we should keep emotion out in that sense. What I'm saying is, in the same sense that that molecules are not themselves science. Science observes molecules, and so I'm saying you could have played a great specimen in that argument by demonstrating how you felt about that, and although you could argue, well, then I'm not being completely logical. I agree, but at the same time, you would have won a lot of, perhaps at least two Calvinists you might have won over to your side, and given them some pause for thought, because hopefully not all Calvinists are completely without empathy.
Maybe we'll have to revisit that someday, but we might that might be a great opportunity for somebody else to take my seat in Clash Course.
Or maybe you should argue for Calvinism, and I'll play the atheist.
That could certainly be effective as well, because frankly, again, so I could be talking to a Calvinism, and it's not going to be real effective for me to bring my emotional response to that into play, because I don't accept it. I never have accepted it. It's not something that was ever even viable enough in my mind to cause an emotional reaction, other than to say that, if that's true, great, then I'm still dead at the end of my life. Nothing is different from what I already expect.
No, actually, you would burn in hell forever. Okay, so...
is that true? I thought Calvinism didn't have a...
Yeah, I think Calvinists do believe in hell. I'm pretty sure.
Well, then that might be a little different, but...
Yeah.
I would still, though, again, go back to my... Even if that was the case, I would willingly accept hell before I would ever worship that God that would create such a thing and condemn people to it. So,
anyways, I don't know how we got off on that tangent, but last week when we were making this argument, I was granting that I don't know, I granted something. You kind of came over to my position, and I also granted that this argument couldn't be won if we applied it to the God of the Bible. And I think I granted that.
Well, yeah, you explicitly stated it when you said that the God of the Bible does things, commits genocide and does malevolent acts. So
yeah, so all that I was trying to argue for was that was that an omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent God could exist like this, and I was also trying for the all-loving, and I don't think that I don't think that I did a very good job there.
That was at the end of the show. You had asked the question. I wrote it down here. It said, "Can love be demonstrated if there is no suffering?"
So that was my moment of comeback. Was when that question dawned on me. And so we're going to explore that more in the last 15 minutes of the show and continue that next week. And this is going to be kind of a new topic transitioning from the old topic. Can love be demonstrated in a world without suffering?
I'm, of course, going to take the yes position on that one.
So you've thought a lot about this since last week?
I put a fair amount of thought into it. I mean, by that I mean about an hour's worth at least. But,
okay.
That's generally all I need to crush you.
All right. So would you like to begin then?
Yeah. I will happily do an opening monologue here. So the question at hand is, can love be demonstrated if there is no suffering? And of course, we haven't really gotten into exactly how we're going to define love or what we're considering love. But we're assuming already right out the door that love is something that should be or needs to be demonstrated, that simply loving something is not enough, but it needs to be demonstrated in a direct way. So that's one that I would love to explore, but I'll grant it for the purposes of this argument, that if there is a loving God, that God would need to demonstrate its love in some way. Primarily, though, my objection to this line of reasoning is one in that I think that it's been embraced very much by many religions, and specifically the Catholics. I've had a fair amount of experience with the Catholics. I am technically a confirmed Catholic because they don't have, by the way, any sort of annulment for a confirmation or a baptism. They only do an annulment for marriage, oddly enough. Who knew? But they
can
so technically they can, but that just means that you can't take communion. You're still technically Catholic.
Oh, wow.
You're just not in communion with God.
So you're stuck.
Right. That I even, and I'm dead serious.
So you actually
here,
aren't an atheist.
Right. I wrote a letter. It depends on who you ask. I've got a great little anecdote about this too, but I wrote a letter to the diocese that has my certificate of confirmation and said, like, hey, I'd like to annul that. What can I do to do that? And they just ignored it. Never got any response whatsoever. I made a couple phone calls too, and they were never returned. But what the anecdote here is, when Casey was born, after a long debate about the merits of infant baptism, I finally acquiesced to Anne's wishes and said, okay, whatever, it's a little water, we can do this. I find it odd and or to initiate somebody against their will, but it's sort of a community welcoming ceremony. So okay, let's do it. And we went to the baptism class. Now, Anne and I are registered with the church as, she is the head of the household for the Christian family, as a Catholic. And it's very clearly written right in all of the, they have this registration thing. My religion, atheist. So we get to this prep class that's like 2 weeks before the actual baptism, and they have the sheet that has verifying your information to put on the baptism certificate, and it's got mom's religion, or mom's name, mom's religion, and Catholic written right in there. It's like dad's name, Greg Brahe, dad's religion, left blank and highlighted. They weren't even willing to write that in. No, they must have misspelled Catholic, I think. They were trying to write Catholic and wrote atheist. But sorry, I had to share an anecdote on that one. I've gotten off track a little, but
that's okay. That is the theme of this show.
That's true. So what I was saying though is, being well versed in the Catholicism. I mean, I've gone through the rite of Christian initiation for adults. I've learned quite a bit about it, and even most the priests will tell you that converts make better Catholics because they know more about the religion than the average Catholic that didn't go through Catholic education. So, given those credentials, I'm going to actually back a bit off of my own and just say that these are a way to help verify this. But Christopher Hitchens did a great amount of work on this subject, specifically as it regards to Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa, who has been beatified and I think may even now officially have been canonized. I didn't look that up, but I know she has been beatified, which is the first step towards becoming a saint officially. And he wrote a book about this called The Missionary Position. Basically, a tongue-in-cheek way of saying that Mother Teresa was screwing the poor by embracing suffering. That suffering is a good thing, and it helps to cleanse us of the evils, and it's God's way of teaching us to grow as humans. And these are trials. There's a great little anecdote that people have about the carrying your cross or your cross to bear. And, a line of people dragging their crosses through the desert. And a woman breaks down and says, God, I can't do this. I can't bear this anymore. Please help me. And he cuts a little bit off of the end of the cross. It's a little bit lighter now. So she says, thank you. And she walks on. And she gets overwhelmed again. And she comes and I can't do it. And he cuts a little bit more off. And this happens 3-4 times. And then suddenly a chasm comes about, and they have to cross this. Different usage of the word cross. They have to traverse this chasm, and everybody else takes the cross off of their back, and they tip it and lay it down across the chasm, and they can walk then across it because
she got screwed.
Yeah, and hers isn't long enough, so instead she falls to her death or something. I don't know. They don't.
Why did God
do
that to her?
Finish that story.
Why did God do that to her?
That she needed the suffering to get past this trial. And it's a very, very Catholic idea. And I mean, other religions embrace it, but really, I mean, these guys have made it a sport of it almost. And it leads to some fundamentally sick ways of viewing the world, in that things that can be done to avoid suffering are seen as sinful or wrong in some way. Even to the point of pain medication for terminal cancer patients. That was specifically Hitchens' point on Mother Teresa, is that she very much so avoided giving any sort of narcotic. I mean, it was Tylenol and aspirin was essentially what the people in her hospices got. And that was because she viewed the suffering to be a good thing. It was a gift from God to help cleanse them and to teach them. And that's certainly something that is related to this idea of suffering being a way of showing love, or even being an opportunity to show love. Now, my actual point as to why I just reject this out of hand, however,
that's disappointing. I thought this was going to be so easy, but that's not your actual point.
No, those are things that I think are related, that are certainly worth talking about.
Darn.
But my actual point here that is associated with this is, let me see, it's a quote that I had copied and pasted, but now I don't know where it went. Come on now. Don't tell me.
I agree with everything that you just said,
here it is.
by the way.
It is here. Without pain, how could we know joy, is one of the other arguments. That suffering, I mean, it's related. It's sort of a different wording of this, but suffering allows joy. Without pain, how could we know joy? And this is an old argument. This is a quote now, John Green, from The Fault in Our Stars, by the way. Without pain, how could we know joy? This is an old argument in the field of thinking about suffering, and its stupidity and lack of sophistication could be plumbed for centuries. But suffice it to say that the existence of broccoli does not in any way affect the taste of chocolate.
That is not true, but I agree that argument is a bit foolish. But the existence of broccoli does in fact change the taste of chocolate, depending on whether you have just put that broccoli in your mouth before you put the chocolate in your mouth.
Yeah, I fundamentally disagree with that. I would say, chocolate, I mean, the experience of it might be...
What is taste except the experience?
Taste itself is a sense. It's a sensory
yes, and your brain has to interpret it.
But I mean the experience as in the holistic bodily experience. You can bring some tastes could potentially, in the right circumstances, bring about euphoria, or absolute fear or disgust. I mean,
Yes.
there's emotional experiences that come along with the sensory experience.
Sure.
And you're bringing up the emotional side of it, which is a fair argument in this case. We're talking about love, which I grant is an emotion. Bob makes an argument that it's a value, which I'm interested in discussing with him.
But you cannot define taste without the human experience.
No, I'm happy to grant that. Taste, however, itself, chocolate tastes like what it tastes like to you. Your experience of that taste might be different. So, I mean, in a very strict sense, he's right that the existence of broccoli does not in any way affect the taste of chocolate. It can affect the experience of that taste, the way that you interpret that taste. But my final, I guess, explanation of why I think that is the best way to say this is the only reason that we would ever have a more positive perception of the taste is because we are weighing things by a relative scale, and not any sort of absolute scale, which is fair. That's the argument that I make all the time, that we can only weigh things on this relative scale to our perception. But nonetheless, chocolate will always be a pleasurable experience to those who eat it. I mean, I guess to those who enjoy chocolate. It sounds a little tautological in that respect, but obviously, if you don't like the taste of chocolate, this argument falls to pieces. But it's an analogy, is what it is. So, chocolate, to anybody who enjoys chocolate, is a pleasurable experience, regardless of whether or not you've ever had a displeasurable experience. That is always a pleasurable experience. The only thing that is required for pleasure to be something that we can understand.
I love that in a moment where you're trying to separate the subjective, that you keep using the word experience.
Sure, that's. I'm not entirely trying to take away the subjective. I'm saying that it is a relative scale, but there's also a midpoint on this relative scale. We can say a neutral point.
As defined by what?
A lack of experience. Would that be the best way to say that? I mean, if you're going to say that there is such a thing as suffering and there is such a thing as pleasure or love, I can certainly recognize that although the scale shifts as to how
I'll grant you that there's a neutral.
We experience these.
I'll grant you that there's a neutral, as long as you grant me that that neutral is not some objective absolute.
Well, what I'm going to say is that the magnitude of the experiences is what's subjective, but the direction is. I don't know if I can even make that argument specific, because it. Of course, it depends on what other relative experience. If you, I mean, I hate to make this kind of an analogy, but if, say, you were abused as a child for eating chocolate, then
your interpretation of what is neutral would be far different than somebody who wasn't abused.
Right, but I'll say that everybody has a midpoint. Okay. That a neutral, a concept of neutral, and the. For things that they do find pleasurable, those things are pleasurable things. Those things that they find displeasurable are displeasurable things. And the only way in which the proximity of experiencing two, or a displeasurable and pleasurable thing, or even two pleasurable things, matters is the magnitude of the experience, never the direction.
Okay.
That eating chocolate and then eating like tiramisu can also affect the. I'm sorry. I was going with baklava is actually the one, because that is.
I think a lot of what you're saying makes sense. You're kind of losing me there at the end, but we are at our end mark. We can take a few more minutes, and I would like to take a little extra time. Do you mind if we break from this for a moment and continue this discussion next week?
Can I just finish that one
Sure.
last, basically one sentence here? So eating chocolate right after eating baklava is going to be a very different experience than eating chocolate right after eating broccoli. But it's only difference in its relative scale of magnitude, and it will never be displeasurable to eat chocolate just because you had a more blissful experience right before it. Likewise, it will never be pleasurable to eat broccoli just because you just ate tree bark immediately before it. If, again, broccoli is something that you don't enjoy. I happen to enjoy broccoli, so I can't really. But
All right. I'm going to let you continue your argument if you have any more to say next week. Are you done with your argument, or will you have more next week?
yeah, I think I'm done with the opening of the argument. That's
Okay.
sort of
Well, then
where it
then
rests.
I'll let you recap next week, and then whenever you're done, I'll pick up.
Okay.
The thing that I wanted to say at the end of this show is I just wanted to go back to something that that perhaps is not said enough in this show, because I have such a dry and sometimes dark sense of humor. I like looking at people in the face and insulting them until they laugh, and it brings me joy. But I want to take a moment to say that I mean, you and I both love giving each other a hard time, but you have been so kind to me in this episode and granting even the slightest victory that I might have had on any of these shows. I really appreciate that, and I wanted to tell you how much I enjoy doing this show with you, and have always enjoyed it. Sometimes I have gotten flat out angry with you, and for various reasons, but I always walk away enjoying that we've had these talks. And I said this in the Cult of Honesty, and I want to say it here, that that I'm not going to say that it's never happened, but I cannot recall at this point discussions in my religious history that have been as meaningful as many of the discussions that I've had with atheists, and mostly you.
Thank you. I would love to say the same of you, but I've had so many meaningful conversations with other the fantastic theists. I mean, I've certainly had far less meaningful conversations with plenty of other people. But even when I went through the RCIA program, I had a wonderful Norbertine priest that had similar conversations with me, and brought a very different perspective to the table. So I very much appreciate your perspective. But I have to say that as far as theists go, you guys just, in general, keep impressing me with your ability to have these conversations when you're willing to do so.
When we're willing to do so. Are you suggesting that there are some times when we're not?
There are plenty of times when plenty
Are you
of
talking
theists
about
are
me?
Nope. That was a general statement to theists. That, there
okay.
are plenty of times when plenty of theists are absolutely unwilling to have these conversations. And the fact that you are, and the fact that there are other people like Bob and Dr. Jones and others that I can seriously disagree with and still have a great and meaningful conversation. It is a significant factor in why I love doing this so much.
All right. You're still wrong. We will see you next week on Clash Course.